I hope you've all been enjoying the World War I history videos I've been creating and how they could possibly tie into Battlefield 1 when that releases later this year. In this video we're going to be talking about the Attack of the Dead, and just by the name you should be able to work out that this isn't any normal battle and this isn't any normal story. Let me set the scene for you. There is a 19th century fortress located in northeastern Poland that was originally built by the Russian Empire. It was called the Oswiec Fortress, and during the First World War it saw heavy fighting as Russian forces defended it for several months against German attacks. In September 1914, German forces, up to 40 infantry battalions, attacked the fortress, and having a huge advantage in numbers they pushed back the Russian defences to a point where artillery could fire on the fortress, but after attempting a full frontal assault on the fortress it was the Germans who were actually cut down by Russian artillery. On the following day the Russians would force the Germans to relocate their artillery by launching a flanking assault, meaning that the Germans were no longer in a position to fire on the fortress. So the Russians managed to hold on to it for a while, but in February of 1915 another deadly attack would take place. German forces once again would attempt to take control of the fortress. It was a long and hard battle in shallow trenches, but the Russians still managed to hold off the Germans once more despite being outnumbered. And after holding their lines, Russian command instructed the forces to pull back to the second defensive line, which had deeper trenches and machine gun placements for supporting fire. And despite the Russians giving no ground, the decision to move to the second line meant that Germans now had the ability to use artillery once again on the fort, and as such heavy artillery rained down on the fortress, 100mm up to 420mm firing every few minutes. So the fortress would take over a week of artillery barrages. 250,000 heavy gunshots were fired and over 1 million light artillery rounds. How can the Russians possibly hold this point? Well, Russian command ordered them to hold out for 48 hours whilst they evacuated civilians, and well, they just about managed it. For half a year they held it when all of the odds were against them, but of course they suffered heavy casualties in the process. Still, even in those horrendous conditions, the Russian forces did manage to destroy 2 out of 4 German heavy mortars, also known as Big Berthas. Now this is where the story gets really interesting. It was the third attack in July that's got the strangest story, and it's quite haunting. German forces under the command of Field Marshal von Hindenburg began another assault on the fortress. You would think by now that they'd learnt, but 14 battalions of infantry, or around 7,000 soldiers, 1 battalion of sappers who are essentially combat engineers, 24 to 30 heavy siege guns and 30 batteries of poison gases. Quite the force, and it heavily outnumbered the Russian defences once more. They really wanted to take over this fortress, and Russia only had 500 soldiers there and 400 militiamen. And so the Germans waited patiently until they had the right conditions to attack with, and on August the 6th they had just the right wind that was required for the attack. The Germans used poison gas attacks against the defending Russian forces there, and then, thinking that they were all dead, they started to advance. As we mentioned before, 7,000 men were involved in the attack, but when the Germans reached the first line of defence, they got a very large shock that they won't forget. Against all of the odds and completely by surprise, the Germans were counterattacked by what was left of the Russian forces, which was only around 60 men, covered in bloody clothing and coughing up blood and pieces of their lungs because of the poison gas attacks destroying their breathing tracts. The sight of these dead looking soldiers coming towards them, attacking, covered in blood, not only shocked the German forces, but it made them retreat. And the last 5 remaining Russian guns opened fire at masses of Germans as they fell back. So imagine you're one of these soldiers in the German army. You've relentlessly attacked a fortress for months, and then you launch a poisonous gas attack and you've left it long enough to take effect. And when attacking the fort, you're greeted with soldiers who are covered in their own blood that they're coughing up, barely able to move walking towards you but still fighting. I imagine it would probably freak you out a little bit as well. You can therefore imagine the stories and why sources since then and media have such referred to them as Russian zombies, and this day as the Attack of the Dead. Not long after the attack and forcing the Germans back, it's said that the remaining Russian soldiers died, literally within minutes, and somehow they found it in themselves to fight for as long as they could to hold their point even when their own bodies were no longer fully operational. Those men, by all accounts, should have been dead, but why weren't they? Of course, you could argue that they were just strong enough to survive the attack and hold on. Russian soldiers, of course, were known for their strength in battle, but there is a side to you that perhaps believes the folk stories about Russian soldiers somehow staying undead for a time to hold their position one last moment. Zombies certainly would fit the bill and makes for a good story. Of course though, the whole zombie story isn't quite grounded in reality, and I'm sure a lot of the information that came from that day is propaganda or urban myth, but it's a pretty cool story nonetheless, and if it's true then you have to commend the bravery of those Russian soldiers. In August 1915, because of the current situation of the war, Russian command ordered the remaining soldiers of the Ozerwick fort to evacuate. There was no longer a strategic reason to hold the fort. The soldiers left, not leaving a single bullet or can of food or shell for the enemies to have. The Russian sappers then blew up everything that remained after the German artillery. The fortress may have gone, but it was never surrendered and never lost. And there's another greater legend than this though. According to urban myths, in 1924, 10 years after the attacks on the fortress, Polish authorities discovered a Russian soldier in the basement. The legend says that this Russian soldier was trapped underground and lived there for years, feeding on the bodies of the dead that the battles of the fortress had left behind. When he was finally let out, apparently he became blind because his eyes were unable to cope with the daylight. And if you believe it or not, it definitely makes for an interesting story, and I wonder if we'll see this in Battlefield 1. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video guys. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, give me a like. If you didn't, a dislike, and I'll see you in the next one.